You want to succeed at your upcoming selection and have questions about the attitude of openness to adopt in connection with intellectual honesty. During a job interview in any industry, a candidate will try to present themselves in the best light, omitting some small details because they want to be hired. What should you admit about your flaws and mistakes at your final interview? Should you sell yourself, and to what extent? If you have a technical mindset, you are certainly asking this question, and if you have a commercial instinct, you're probably wondering that too. I've been there just like you. I read that intellectual honesty was very important in the eyes of airline recruiters. My name is Guillaume, and as you know, I had a successful career culminating as a Boeing 777 captain at Emirates. Before that, I was the first French pilot with a JAR license to pass the main selection at British Airways, where I spent 7 years on the Airbus 320 and then the Boeing 777 before moving to Emirates, where I was a co-pilot, recruiter, and then captain. I spent a total of 9 years over there. My misinterpretation of what the first airline I applied to, Air France, meant by intellectual honesty cost me my selection, and the consequences were significant in my life. The bankruptcy of Air Liberté and its bad timing contributed to my adjournment. But I will come back to this aspect in another video, as it provides additional lessons on what happens at the managerial level in the selection department. Things you absolutely need to know and that I want to bring to you. But let's return to intellectual honesty and what happened on the day of my assessment. Was I too honest? Yes. Am I telling you to be dishonest? Certainly not. And you're probably thinking you don't know where I'm going with this. Yet this point is essential. The misinterpretation of intellectual honesty that I made that day is one of the main mistakes, if not the main mistake, that candidates make in selections. I will personally never make it again, and I will succeed in all the selections of my life after that. Understanding it was therefore a turning point. At that time, during Air France selections, there were 2 group tests, one quite easy, which we solved quickly and efficiently, and a second very complex one. At one point, I felt we weren't going to make it, and I wrote an equation on paper whilst listening to the others. This lasted for about 30 seconds. I suggested to the team to reconsider part of the calculations that were causing us difficulties. My equation wasn't perfect, but we worked on this basis, and in the end, it provided an imperfect but sufficient answer. Rather good, given the difficulty. There were then 2 individual interviews, one with a psychologist and one with 2 pilots. Both went very well, I thought. During one of the 2 interviews, I was asked how I felt during the group assessment. Instead of focusing on our successes and leaving it at that, by talking about how good teamwork was and everyone's contribution had felt, I explained how I felt when we couldn't solve the second riddle. I said, we were a bit lost at one point, and I had to write an equation. They asked me, sorry, were you lost? I replied, we all were. The situation was complex. And then I explained how we got out of it. But the recruiters only remembered the part where I was lost. And that's what was relayed to me during my debriefing. Then they told me, yes, there was the Air Liberté story, and a lot of pilots are being adjourned at the moment. But what we've put on your file is that you admitted to being lost. However, in terms of intellectual honesty, you scored top marks. Come back in 2 years. And then I said, but I greatly contributed to solving the riddle. We were all lost, but only for a few seconds. And then he told me, I wasn't there. I wasn't your recruiter, but I see that many favorable opinions were put on your file. Don't worry. You were close and you certainly have the qualities to be a pilot, but in the meantime, we are not going to change your file. I left feeling reassured, and of course I was sad all the same. But this debriefing was very useful to me, and I'm so grateful that Air France does these debriefings, as it built a desire to persevere into me. But had I just not been so honest about this shortcoming that I felt for 30 seconds, maybe I would have managed to stay in my home country, which would have been probably a lot better for me. I'm not complaining, because in the end, I made a really nice career. And mostly I remember during this period that it was quite tough, because it cost me a lot of extra costs, readjustments. And in the end, I had a really good outcome, but it was not without pain. I had to go through type rating and all these things. It was tough. It took me time to digest all this, because I had done exactly what was asked. I had prepared a lot. I had been honest. I knew it was very important to Air France that you'd be honest, and here was the result. If I kept quiet about that equation, it might have been different. If I tell you all this, is because I now understand the recruiter and why they didn't take me, and I want to prevent this from happening to you. The recruiter, and I explained this well in Advanced Interview Course version 2, measures risk throughout the selection. His or her fear is that you will have difficulties during your training or pose recurring CRM problems that will lead to the reopening of your recruitment file. 10% of pilots cause 90% of problems. And of course, as recruiters, we don't want to hire those 10%. We want to avoid that as much as possible. So if there is a risk that is perceived, we're not going to take it. Intellectual honesty, as we said, is listed as a key competency with many airlines. You cannot ignore this. But then What does this really mean? Let me first tell you what intellectual honesty is not. It is not about detailing all your flaws or failures, nor about telling a recruiter about all the underperformances you've had in your life. Some candidates tend to want to relieve their conscience in order to be like an open book capable of gaining the recruiter's trust. It's the opposite that happens. Some even go as far as unconsciously exaggerating certain mistakes by adding superlatives. Oh, it was a really bad flight. Stop this. You're here above all to sell yourself and to be hired. Put yourself in the recruiter's shoes. By admitting flaws too poignantly, you will significantly increase their perception of risk and you will not be hired. Do you understand? Now, let me tell you what intellectual honesty really is. It's about demonstrating that while you are excellent at your job, you sometimes make mistakes from which you learn a lot each time. You share these mistakes with your colleagues and the company without delay and without ulterior motives. Intellectual honesty is having confidence in the fact that reporting your mistakes is the right act and that the company will do what is necessary to protect you if you tell them what happened, within reason, of course. The chief pilot of British Airways on my first day gathered the 20 of us there and said, "We will never blame you for making a mistake. We all make mistakes. We will protect you as much as we can if you raise your hand, but we will not forgive you for not saying anything. So be honest, but remember that you are in an interview room and it's about presenting yourself in the best light whilst being humble and with a good dose of this naturalness you will build by preparing. Obviously, if you're asked a question aimed at making you admit a mistake, you will have prepared this answer in advance. You will come to the interview with 4 or 5 mistakes that are interesting and that you can articulate lots of thoughts around that you will have ready-made, ready prepared for the recruiter on which you have a fertile ground for discussion. It's part of your job to have this ready for the recruiter. You will readily admit that you have not always been perfect, but you will need to choose these examples very carefully and continue to be appealing by showing how much you've learned from these little mistakes that happened a long time ago and that you no longer make now. I remind you that the recruiter must do a quality job and document your file. If they perceive the slightest risk that might exceed tolerances, they will not take the risk of hiring you. The recruiter is here to recruit you, however, and will probably be very sorry if you admit an unnecessary mistake. Prepare yourself and help him or her to recruit you. You understand that there is a codified logic to all this, a game to play and to understand well. And you now understand how important it is not to dwell on mistakes for too long. You need to be appealing, bring out a feeling of mastery, lead and keep the interview as much as possible on a constructive ground. Always put your best foot forward. Many of my friends who passed airline selections after me are military. They are really nice guys and fundamentally honest. When I ask them if they admitted certain career mistakes during their Air France selection, they tell me, of course not. Let's be reasonable, we're at an interview, not in a debriefing room. You see, so if they know that, if they behave like that, probably you should too. Succeeding in your selections is an exercise where you must, whilst remaining humble and professional, highlight your strengths and capabilities. You need to come well prepared with many well-chosen examples whose process and outcome leave no doubt or perceived risk in the demonstration of your skills. Talk about your mistakes only when asked. Prepare good examples that highlight them in the context of their occurrence. Immediately steer the conversation to what these mistakes taught you and to the positive. Now, I hope that these explanations have been helpful to you, and I'll see you very soon in our pre-courses and in Advanced Interview Course version 2, which will allow you to step up your game ahead of your selection. You will find relevant links in the description, and we can connect together on WhatsApp and on Discord. And if you like this channel, don't hesitate to give us a like and to subscribe.